Thanks everybody for hopping on the Code Review Weekly Workshop. I've got just one small topic to bring up, but if you all had any other things you wanted to show and tell or questions about code review, if you want to add it to the agenda, and then we can pair on a code review afterwards. Um, so yeah, I'll go ahead and kick us off. I'll share my screen so we're looking at the same thing. So I got pinged to review this MR, which is great, but made me nervous immediately because I saw, oh no, we're touching notes. Uh and and deprecated notes as well. And notes are just like notoriously flaky, and there's duplication and there's some technical debt here. So I was a little nervous about some of the changes, and just to highlight what some of the changes were was, I guess we had this non-reactive property that we were setting inside of a method before submitting things, and we're removing it now into the data of the component and setting it as soon as, oh, here's the update. Why does it keep going down? Yeah, we're moving it to the data of the component, and then we're also adding it. We're kind of changing this line. So my ears are really perked up, wanting to be extra sensitive to what are hidden side effects to this thing. And so this is the main thing I wanted to communicate is when I come across some bit of code that's super high traffic, because this is nodes, but is also crazy large with lots of technical debt all around and everything. I've got to ask myself, what is the worst thing that could happen, and try to mitigate that as much as possible. So like the worst thing that could happen as I look at, well, hopefully I can still submit notes and create threads on MRs, issues, and all the different types of issuable types. I don't see anything with these changes that would be different based on different issuable types. So when I'm testing things, I don't feel like, oh, I need to check out incidents and I need to check out commit issues, although commits and snippets are handled in the deprecated notes bit. But one thing that I did know, like, okay, if we're changing the way we initialize this thing at different times, that does have like a side effect of, rather than setting it here, if we're setting it when we've created the thing, what if this thing has changed since then? And what is this old content even supposed to do in the first place? And so I did try to recreate a scenario where, like, okay, the note has been created, but it's changed after this bit has been done, and then we submit, and like, is all of that expected to work as possible? But I couldn't find anything. So then I ended up just asking a question of like, hey, so like there's a small side effect of making this change. And then mainly just asking like, okay, is it any possible that this side effect can cause any damage? And was aware of this and just said like, but that they couldn't think of a actual scenario where it will play out. So so then that was kind of good enough for me. I tested it out locally. And then neither of us could think of a scenario. It was brought up of like, oh, well, do we want to just add a watcher to this? But like at this point, I'm just so afraid of touching this thing and unintended side effects that I was like, okay, if it's working as it is, let's just keep it. Yeah, so it's challenging. Like, so we did have tests to update, but here with deprecated notes, so deprecated notes is still used to render comments from commits and snippets. However, deprecated notes spec is skipped because it's flaky. And so it's like, oh my, the whole unit test for this deprecated thing is skipped.
That is the boldest statement I've heard this week. That is
I know. So like I was testing these things out and I was trying to like reverse engineer, okay, what was the actual changes we're trying to make here? And but yeah, I just wanted to share like sometimes we get code reviews for high traffic things touching, touching the power of sticks and just moving something very slightly. And this can cause, catastrophic failures. Hopefully we have like feature tests that can catch those things, but it's really, really worth asking at a high level from a black box perspective without looking at the code. What's the worst thing that can happen? And then after looking at the code, what's the worst thing that can happen? And then trying to mitigate that from all the S ones until like, okay, we're talking about edge cases here. I think we gotta just move forward. So yeah.
Quick question, if I may, like, how do you plan on carrying on with this? Because like, if I think about the changes that this MR introduces in deprecated nodes and the fact that it actually doesn't have any tests when they were skipped, like this is kind of equal to not have any tests. What do we do with that? Like, I would maybe that's over the top, but I would lean like, okay, as long as we don't have any tests for this, and it's important, just don't touch it at this point, or find another way, or go make the tests not flaky and get some coverage first.
I think those are great ideas. I lean towards I tested it out manually. So and it was broken, but it was pre-existingly broken. So the actual notes themselves were like really wacky. And so I was like, I don't know. I think we just have to migrate deprecated notes to other notes. But I think it's a great idea to like, okay, why are we skipping all of the unit tests? Why don't we just skip the ones that are actually flaky? Or maybe we need to create deprecated notes, not flaky spec for just these changes. But yeah, that's a good question. I agree with what you're saying is like, yeah, if we don't have tests for it, if it's flaky, we probably shouldn't touch it. For some reason, this was like labeled like P1 because it's related to some other thing that they're trying to do. Oh, do you hear my alarm going off?
Didn't hear anything.
Oh, okay. My house alarm's going off. I guess this means the kids are up.
As long as there's no fire.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure they're pretty good. They know how to they've read books about volcanoes. They know how to take care of fire. Let me turn off the alarm because it looks like my wife is not waking up to do it either. So but that was all I wanted to share. I'll be right back.
Awesome. Sweet. In the meantime, James, I know you've got something on your plate. Should we just try and start with it and see when Paul comes back?
Sorry. Yep. Sounds good. Let me open it up. Okay. So yeah, so with this MR, on first glance, I had a look at it. I saw, okay, like it's just changing something straightforward. There's nothing complex here. So like, I'm sure it's fine. Like if someone's doing this on purpose, it's fair enough. Like it's community, but it's like, it's not really community. So I figured must be a good reason. So, okay, fine with me. And then I saw a note from Kasha here saying like, she said, I don't know what this does, so I'm not going to approve it. But probably James knows because he's more front end focused. But I was like, I don't know what it does. I'm sure it's fine. so then I approved it, and then I was like, and then I saw this, and I was like, oh, oops. yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I should have given
Happened to
that
all of
a
us.
little bit more thought. So yeah, trying to work out well, I guess there's a few things I want to know. One is like, what is my responsibility as a reviewer? Like, why is this being done? Like, who's asking for it to be done? Like, how much am I, is it my responsibility to dig into this? Or because I sort of figured like with something like this, my responsibility is like, are you introducing any bugs? Or, you know what I mean? Like with something like this, it seems like pretty straightforward. So I'm
Okay.
sure it's fine.
Yeah, I'll give this a shot. So I quickly skimmed through this MR, so I partially know what I'm speaking about here, but how I am reading this thing. If you go to the changes tab one more time, to me this feels like a little. We are looking at all those pages. Like these are the ones we care about. Like merge requests, merge method settings, options, whatnot. I think the author has a point, as if in these pages are CE only at that point and are like, it is kind of unnecessary for us to use this function. And if I read it correctly, it will save them like some override or some workaround or whatnot. The problem that I see with that is that this pattern that we're using, rendering everything in CE by default, and then we're going to also have an EE page just in case we need it. That is, I would argue, like an architectural question in our code base. So that's where things getting a little tricky, as if in like rendering things CE is our default, and then when we need an EE page, we'll just add an render EE method, and this will just work. And if we introduce this change, this will not be the case anymore.
So like, why would someone want something to be CE is community edition, right? What's the point of having it community edition only? Like, is this like community edition is the base, right? Or
yeah,
right. So this echoes how we do EE overrides in the front end, where the EE override will need to oh, we have EELC. That's right. That we have that prefix. I haven't used that in a long time. The EELCE prefix. But then EE often needs to import specifically CE to override it. So that's when we would use render CE. Otherwise, you'd end up with a loop. If I had EE override HAML view, and then that HAML view rendered itself, trying to reference the CE version of the view, it would end up in a loop. So that's the only time I think we want to use render CE or render EE. We wouldn't use render EE. That's something that Jihu would probably just use. But in this case, that like there's a small side effect that could happen by changing these from render CE to render, which would be if these had previously EE specific pages or EE views. And if they don't, then we're probably fine. But yeah, the only time I think we would want to use render CE by itself is if we have a specific page that's targeting a specific CE page. We would need to break out of our automatic render overriding thing so that we don't end up in a forever loop. Does that make sense?
it doesn't make sense to me at all.
Okay. I'm probably doing a bad job explaining it.
So no, like it's a complicated part that I've never touched. But my question is, like, at what point should I be like, oh, this is not my area, I'm out, hand it over to someone else? And at what point should I be like, okay, I should understand how this works properly? You know what I mean?
Yeah, to answer that question, I would argue whenever you feel uncomfortable. Like if you get assigned to an MR and you don't really feel it, and you'd be like, okay, it'll probably take me a long time to actually figure it out. I would always recommend to keep on following it to actually check out the resolution on this. But if you're feeling, if you're assigned to anything that is not in your ballpark for whatever reason it might be, don't be ashamed or afraid to just loop in anybody else. There's like
Okay.
no shame in it.
Yeah, but I think like looping it in to and then anticipating on gaining like the understanding, because hopefully growing the knowledge of the code base is something that we could do collaboratively.
And then like on top of that, I know this is pushing it too far, pushing the example too far, but like at what are there parts of the code base where you are like, nah, I'm out.
Geo,
And how do you recognize them? Sorry, say that again, Yannick.
I just said Geo. I don't know if you had any touch points with it, but in the very short story is like when you need to have multiple GitLab instances that communicate with each other, and it's very hard to reproduce locally. So that is definitely, and I learned that through pain. I learned that since I tried to set it up locally, and it was really painful.
Yeah, there's many times I feel like, oh no, I don't want to do this. And but I don't think unless it's like clearly inefficient for me and it'd be super efficient for someone else, then I might say like, oh, hey, do you have capacity to do this? Because you're very familiar with all this. Can you do that? If it's a case where somebody's got to do it, we've all got to chip in. It's like, okay, I've got to, and emails is the bit that will come up there for me. It's like anything that's changing how we do emails. I had to deep dive into that topic like maybe a year plus ago, which is normally something I avoid because it's a lot gnarlier than our other views. But yeah, that comes up. But I think here looking at this one, like, so the Jihu context is interesting if you're not familiar with it. But I think you can do a search for render CE, and I would recommend just doing a project-wide search. If like, what in the world is this doing? How do we use this thing? I would do a project-wide search for a thing of like, okay, how do we use it in other places, and is it making sense there? And if we do that real quick, do you happen to have the GitLab project open?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you just do a project-wide search for render CE, you'll see a whole bunch of, so there's like, it looks like documentation on it, but you'll see a whole bunch of these views that do it just once because it's doing that override thing that I was talking about. Because it's rendering itself, but the CE version of itself. But the parts that stand alone are like the merge request settings is being updated here, where it doesn't need to be doing that. That's breaking this pattern. And I think doing a search for sometimes just looking through the code base of other times we do a thing that can shine a different perspective on the thing you're looking for at.
Sorry, so why is this different?
If you look at like take the second example there, the email settings, and you look at the path that we're rendering, it's the same as the path of this view.
I see.
And if you look at the documentation, I'm pretty sure that's what it's describing as well. It says, and it's saying this is, yeah, could be referring to the CE partial and CE, while EE partial is EE. This way we could show different things in CE and EE. However, sometimes we would also want to reuse the CE partial and EE partial. And that's the use case for this function.
Cool.
So,
so
just
the process
searching for a
here,
thing
Yeah, would be like, I don't know what this is or how it works, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to understand it. If I have capacity, I'll spend more time.
And
Otherwise,
that's
pass it on.
so that, and it's so valuable. Like having, I am completely on the outside. I'm not familiar with this, and this doesn't make any sense. Is really great feedback to get. I mean, try to spend 5 minutes sense making of it, but then after you've spent that time and you still can't make sense of it, give that feedback of, I'm trying to understand this, and these are the questions I have about it. Let me loop in someone else. That's a totally great feedback to get. If you just back down of like, I don't want to review that. Oh man, that's me. Oh, what was I doing there? Yeah, I would put in an effort to try to review, even if it's really outside your territory, because that outside perspective is really valuable.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. What do you think, Yannick? Do you think it's?
I highly agree. I don't know with my very first statement, what I said would be the same what you just said, but that was basically what I meant. So yeah, absolutely. I do think that there is a lot of value in anybody trying to get their head around it, and especially providing feedback. Because maybe the docs are not yet where they should be, or whatever it might be, that is kind of making this easier for outsiders to understand this. So yeah, highly agree. Still don't feel like that you would have to bring this over the finish line if you're uncomfortable with that. But yeah, even like a quick statement about the current state or the level of understanding, and especially the problems with it as a statement, and then getting in some help. Absolutely the best way to deal with that.
Yeah. And this comes up for me too, if like we're using a technology or like a third-party library that I'm not familiar with. I may realize I have no familiarity with this. I guess I'm gonna, excuse myself, or I'll open up docs and other examples using this third-party library and compare it to what we're doing. And just recently I saw like, oh, we're not using, we weren't using one of our Sentry methods as it kind of seemed to be anticipated to being used based on the docs. And so just doing that outside perspective can go really long way of so I would recommend trying to not excuse yourself, but definitely time blocking yourself is a wise thing if you're needing to do investigation.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
What'd you say, Yannick?
Can I just quickly come across with a technical question on this, because
Sure.
I'm currently at a dangerous level where like I have understood parts of it, but not a complete thing. So regarding the render CE function, do I get this right that when we would replace all our renders by render CE, we should kind of get away with it, as if in like this wouldn't change anything for us?
If we replace render with render CE,
Exactly.
it would mean that we won't try to look for EE version of a view.
We would ignore the EE version.
Yeah. And would possibly break GU.
Okay, because that is, if you could open the MR once more, James, there's like one slight thing that I would worry about when accepting these changes.
Yeah, one sec.
No worries. So how I read this, or how I get this currently. So basically the author is saying like this is currently done with render CE, but there is no actual EE page for it. So we can just use the render and it won't have any effect. What I would worry in terms of like, this is would be more soft rule than actually, but if I would come to the code base and I would need to introduce like an EE partial for one of those pages, then I would worry that we might be in trouble, as if in like that might, you could argue that that would be my problem, but I would maybe assume that this would just work out of the box, and as if I would go in and be like render EE and potentially break something. So what I'm trying to say is, if there is no harm currently in the render CE, like this is like a trade-off, but it'll make it easier for us to add on EE partials, then why not just keep it?
Are you saying that there's no harm with this? There's no harm with the CE. We're being more explicit, and so future changes won't accidentally bump into anything.
100%.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. The situation with Jihu is that it causes them some harm. So if you're Jihu's forked GitLab, so we have one tier of CE changes. EE then provides some overriding sometimes on top of those CE changes. Then Jihu provides some overriding on top of all of those. That's external from our code base. But every once in a while, we have to merge in extension points for their project. And that's the situation here. Is I imagine if you dive into one of the issues or contexts, is they're wanting to actually have a JH version of one of these views or something.
Yes, that's very right. If we go see the overview tab once more, if I recall it correctly, there was like a statement regarding a workaround for them. Wasn't it? Use render to allow Jihu to override the template for. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Let me quickly.
So do you see like
what I'm trying, the point I'm trying to make is, if there is like an acceptable workaround for Jihu, this boils down to a little bit of there is none.
Yeah, no, and
Okay.
I think this is just how they're anticipate. I'm like, there's likely other hacks that you can go around it, but the render function is how I think they most likely anticipate being able to extend. But with that being said, like you're right, adding an EE view can have unintended side effects. So we're not, every time we add an EE view, you have to be mindful of the naming collision that could possibly happen in CE. So that's one thing to be aware of as reviewing and authoring front-end code, is new HAML views could conflict in names, and it's a thing.
And on the other hand, we are using the render method a lot of times in our code base, so it's not like it's deprecated or whatever.
Yeah. So I think the intention of the render CE and EE is meant only for when we are doing an explicit override. We can call the super class.
So the render CE is not the default.
No.
You should go for.
Yeah, so you got to be really careful with adding new HAML views and make sure that the names don't conflict. That's something that when I think about what's the worst thing that could happen, that's one thing I think about.
Yeah, HAML paths are always fun. Sorry.
Oh yeah, lots of little little traps. Cool. Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, and it's good to be thinking from an outside perspective. Is like those, maybe there is another way of doing things, and like you don't get that when you're really used to this, and it's like, oh, this is just the way we do it. You don't get those thoughts as often, and so I love when people from without familiarity review MRs, because that's really sweet collaboration and ideas come from sometimes.
Was that helpful to you, James? Like, do you now feel prepared to bring this to the next step?
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, makes sense. Yeah, no, it really does. Thanks.
Okay. Well, cool. Did we have anything else on the agenda, or did we want to maybe pair up on a merge request
Nothing
review?
else on the agenda. I have another one that I'm a bit stuck on.
Sure.
Reviewing. Could we bring that one up?
Yeah, let's do that. That sounds
That's
great. Ooh, wikis. I'm out. Dimitri has been let's say on fire has got to be the word. I've received so many community contributions from Dimitri. So props to the contributor for being extra busy.
So I'm really not sure if if this is in Vue, I can read it and be like, yeah, here are the problems. But in HAML, I'm like, okay, no, I need to line by line, spend a lot of time understanding this. I don't know what is I'm not familiar. I still can't get my head around the syntax, or I don't know when. I can't see errors. I can't see them.
Yeah.
I
find it usually hard to read the diff from the MR view, because I think sometimes the code editor is able to figure out white space changes and other things better than our merge request view. So do you want to review this one together?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Can we maybe check out the diff locally? Can I show you my favorite way of doing this?
Yeah, please.
So if you have a terminal open, and if you can check out master, but if you have changes that you get it, okay, great. All right. And you can update if you want to, but you don't have to. If you go back to the merge request, and then copy the URL. Yeah. And then go back to the terminal and then do curl and then the URL space, but then get rid of the /diffs part and replace it with a .diff. Yeah. And then space pipe git apply. This is my favorite way to review MRs locally, because I don't have to worry about changing branches and I see all the changes. So then what I'll do as the very last step is I usually stage all the changes, because if I find myself making changes on top of it, since they're different between what's staged and my head changes, then I can keep those. So yeah, I'll do. Cool. All right, so let's check it out. So we got wiki's main links. So it looks like we're switching the order of something. So I see this page history thing is getting removed. Right? But is it being replaced with?
I don't know. Honestly, I tried to look at this several times, and every time I did, I was just like, I don't know what's going on. I can't handle this. I'm out.
Yeah. One thing we could possibly do is to understand what's actually changed between two lines that aren't right next to each other. I'll actually I'll move the lines and the code to compare it. But since we staged the change, we won't get that view. We'll have to unstage it and then move the lines around. If we want to try that out. So I'll that if can, that's on line 6 and 7. Yeah, I'll move that up to the line that we removed, and so we can see what's actually changed. Oh, you go up one more, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
So
then this line is the same.
Yeah, that line's kind of the same. So what I find really, really interesting is all of a sudden, for some reason, we're adding more conditions to the page history button. And so I'd want to understand the context of like, why are we adding the conditions? Line 2, the condition seems really long. I was like, okay, maybe this needs, rather than doing all this logic in the presentation HAML layer, maybe the logic should be, I'm such a bad Rails backender, maybe it should be in the helper. I don't know. Let's keep looking at the rest of the button. The button's really long. If we scroll to the right on line 3. So yeah, oh yeah, so look at this. So that's edit. We've totally lost the history button altogether. Ah. Okay, so that's why it's it's wrapped up in, how interesting.
So one of the things that was a bit overwhelming to look at is in the differences, particularly like this makes sense. Like if we do, okay, that's what it was. Now it's here. Okay, I'm cool.
And that's where page history went. I see. I see.
But on mobile, this looks real weird. Oops.
Yeah, look at that cool little
Hang on.
pencil button.
Okay. I don't know what's happening here.
Yeah.
Quick idea on how I tend to approach like HAML changes that I, like you, also tend to not understand or just having a hard time getting into it. Executing it and actually looking at the output at HTML helps me a lot, and that is what I kind of care about. Maybe even like from the checking master back out and looking onto what this was and then the actual outcome of the changes introduced. So that is then when I know whether I like it, what's coming out of it, or if I do see any issues, and can then go search for them in the HAML. That makes it for me way easier than trying to make sense out of this HAML gibberish.
Camel
That makes sense.
You don't like camel?
It's too close to YAML for me.
I see. I see. It has a significant lack of curly braces and pointy brackets. I started teaching my daughter. She really wanted to code. Like she's done Scratch before, but she was wanting to do like some actual coding. And so part of me is always like, okay, do I do Python? But I was like, it's gonna be a while before she's actually using a GUI. I was like, okay, we're just jumping right into HTML, JavaScript, because that's the most immediate feedback you get from doing stuff. But every time I teach HTML to someone, they always laugh at me when I talk about open pointy, the pointy brackets. And they're like, is that what you call them? It's like, oh, I thought you were smart. Okay. Like, yeah, you get your pointy, your curlies.
I'm still getting sweaty hands from, like, I remember when I joined GitLab, and people, you should remember this, Paul, from all over the world tried to explain me stuff, and I was just typing, and everybody had a different name for a different bracket, and I was just sitting on my keyboard being like, I have no idea. Wait, what? So yeah, it can get quite messy.
Is there another name besides the pointy for these things? The pointy bracket?
I've heard it called arrow brackets.
Oh, geez, that looks so confusing.
Alligator. I have heard that.
The open chompers. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think your point, Yannick, about actually running it is a big deal, because sometimes you'll find that like, oh, we're setting an attribute that's not even being read. It's just being written as an HTML attribute to this thing. So that's checking it out. These HAML things is a really wise idea. And I like that. I would
Sorry, so do you mean like inspecting it? And
yeah, I would inspect
Okay.
it to see how these things are actually being structured, because sometimes it's like, oh, well, the way it's being rendered is all of this, we're putting divs inside of a span now or something. And okay. Okay. Yeah, so there's our main links, and look like, yeah, we end up with just the A button, and then we've got the wiki actions drop down. Cool. Yeah, these are just hrefs for it.
How much are you also getting involved in like the like design or usage? Like
Yeah, that's a really
like
great
how
question.
opinionated are you? Or if you're like, oh, this seems weird, do you just pull in a UX or
This is a great question. So I'll get involved if I feel like, if I see UX has looked at this, but what I'm seeing still seems very questionable, I'll leave a UX question. Of re-pinging back to UX, like, hey, are we really sure about this? Have you looked at this side effect of that? And I'll do that. Sometimes UX has made a decision and I'm saying, hey, speaking as a user, this is what it all communicates to me, and none of this is helpful. Can we please not do this? I'll do that. But in this situation, since UX is currently assigned to it, I'm not going to be super concerned about UX things at this moment. I know after UX has given all their feedback, the MR is probably going to look different. So I'm really looking at this moment for, are we approaching, are we doing anything from a front end perspective that's a really off approach, or have we not set up tests for this thing, or whatever that is. And test is a big deal. If you actually go back to the MR div, I say test is a big deal, and I merged a whole MR that totally skipped tests for deprecated nodes. We have HAML tests, and we have, non-trivial conditions that we're adding here, like, can we create a wiki page latest invalid encoding? And those, it's worth, I think it's worth figuring out. Yeah, we probably should add tests to these. And so there's a whole thing called HAML specs. And if since this is a community contributor, they may feel a little uncomfortable doing that. So I will probably reach to a backend. I'll ask them, hey, let's try to add some tests for this, some HAML tests for this. Here's an example. I'll do a project-wide search for a HAML spec. But then I'll also leave as like, hey, if you need some help doing this, let me know. And then I'm anticipating I'm reaching out to a backend engineer to help the community contributor write some HAML tests.
okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful. I don't know why I was just stuck on it. Just
Well, I mean, it is
sense.
it is harder to follow because of how long these lines are, I think. But yeah, so I think if the UX is cool with this change, at that moment, I was concerned that, like, oh, we're getting rid of one of our buttons, but I see it goes here into the drop down. So I'd want to just double check if you scroll down. I'd want to double check that we're not losing any of our conditions as we've moved some of these things around. Oh, and so yeah, you see on line 27 that we removed on the show HTML HAML. That's where that funky condition comes from. So it makes sense. Like, okay, I see we're just moving stuff around. We maybe don't need to. Maybe we don't need to. What am I trying to say? Refactor
the tests will
them
still
are.
probably work if there is a test.
Well, I would suggest testing it, especially because we're kind of, I don't know.
Sorry, I haven't used HAML tests at all. How would I find that?
That's a good
HAML
question.
test for
If you go
this?
ahead and go back to your VS Code, and then I would do a fuzzy file find for HAML underscore spec, I think. Yeah. So these are all these like HAML tests.
Okay.
So you see how in the description we're specifying a HAML view, and then
Where's the description? Sorry. Oh, yeah. This.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. And so you gotta just embrace the R spec Rails magic.
Yeah.
That automatically associates this whole test with that view. So when you run on line 20 render, rendered will be the HTML of the thing.
Yes. Okay.
But you see, like beforehand, we're specifying that, hey, these views can receive current user and we have to specify all of the collaborating parameters. So I would add just one test for the show HAML spec that the buttons show up. And maybe that test already exists. And since we're just moving things around, it all works.
To find that, I'm just going to do a search for the name, right? Maybe without this.
Yeah, except I would look for the show one, the wiki show.
This one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
And I think we might have to do the fuzzy file name search for it. And if we do underscore spec,
okay.
Maybe if we add a wiki at the front of this. No. I don't think we do have it.
It would also have to have the name of the file in it, right?
Oh, that's true. That's true. I didn't realize.
Have...
Oh, you're totally right. I wasn't thinking it would, but it totally does. Sorry about that.
All right.
And it'll have the whole path to it too. So it should be wiki/show. Yeah, you see, we don't do HAML specs a lot. Because they're not necessarily loads of fun. But it's also worth looking at, maybe we have feature specs for these. And so we can, well, see, we have like QA selectors and stuff. So we definitely have end-to-end tests for some of these, I guess. But maybe if we have other test IDs, we can search. Oh, there's a test ID, the wiki page. Oh, that's just the page title though. Yeah, if we go back to, if we don't need to do a HAML spec, if we have feature tests for this, if we have a test ID, if you go to the far right, there's a QA selector for the new page button. There we go, the wiki edit button. I bet a feature spec references that. It just says have selector. Okay, all right. This is like doing a HAML spec at the feature level, which is fine-ish, I guess.
Doesn't sound fun.
Ideally,
what
yeah.
You mean is it's just checking to see that there is an edit button. It's not testing the edit button.
Yeah, that's what I'm observing. But look, we can also click on page history, like it's showing that, oh, does this test even work? Is this working? I don't think it would on line 127. I bet the pipeline's failing.
Yeah, pipeline is failing.
Did it not even run? It probably didn't run because
sure it did. Why else would it? Like, this looks like it ran, right? But there's no. I'm sure looking.
Do you click on the large number, the 897? You know what? This is a really unhelpful view.
I'm sure like earlier today, it had stages listed out.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
One thing that can happen is the community contributor runs out of minutes contributing.
Oh yeah.
See you, Yannick. Yeah, and we'll hop off. the community contributor can run into issues running the pipeline, and then we somehow need to, like, maybe it won't run on our end unless someone approves it or we add a label or something like that.
And just
Oh yeah, or click run pipeline might be a good idea. There's no malicious code in it, is there? Yeah.
all right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, yeah, it looks like we have feature tests pretty much covering. So I'll just take a glance through those. But it does seem like those might need to be updated because we'll need to open the drop down before hitting the page history button and stuff like that. So it's but yeah, some of these HAML ones get difficult to follow. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
Well, thanks.
Great.
Thanks for
That's
bringing it
super
up,
useful.
though. It's very interesting,
Thanks.
James. Appreciate it. Well, I'll let you go, and thanks for hopping on.
Great. Talk later.
All right.
Bye.
See you. Bye.